Welcome back to Cleaving Thought from Bone with your host, Sociopathic. Tonight, we weave you one unbelievable tale. Unbelievable, that is, until it happens to you. So, lock your doors, turn down your lights, and count your closest of friends. You may need them sooner than later. No one will believe me.
The power went out last night, and it's still out today. For most people, this would be a mild inconvenience, or with the dependence upon electronics in today's day and age, a major inconvenience for some. But as for me, this could literally be a matter of life or death. Because every week, they come out. The monsters in the darkness. The first time I saw them was a late Wednesday evening. Sometime in early autumn of last year, I was pulling some weeds out of my garden and the sun was just setting between the mountains west of my home. I decided that I had done enough gardening for the day when I looked out to the forest, which lay about 20 or so yards ahead of me, and something quickly caught my eye. I watched as this little thing began to stumble out of the woods. At first, I thought it was some small critter being attacked by a rather large snake, but as I got closer, I realized that what I initially thought was two animals was actually a singular being. My heart began to race as the creature approached, flopping and writhing about the grass. I stayed just long enough to get a better look at it. It was about the size of a small coyote, which is one of the animals I thought it could have been at first because it was kind of built like one. But as I got closer, instead of flopping about, it began to steady itself and it started walking upright, like a person. It was walking on two legs like a human being. It's hard to explain how crazy and unnatural this thing looked. Imagine a coyote walking on two legs. Okay, now replace the paws of the coyote with four hand-like appendages with four long, spindly, thin, bone-like fingers on each of them. Each of these disturbingly misshapen hands was connected to the coyote-shaped body, a body that was mostly bald, a tannish, grayish color with patches of thin, wiry, gray and white hairs all strewn about. Yes, I let it get close enough to get that much detail. But the most disturbing thing about this creature was its head. Remember how I said I originally thought it was a small coyote being attacked by a rather large snake? Well, the creature's skin changed at around its neck. It went from a grayish tan color of the rest of its body to the stark contrast of a bright, glistening red. I could see that the skin continued up a thin, misshapen line along the back, but the front of this thing's head was more like a visceral, open wound than the creature's actual head. The front of the thing's crown was covered with bulbous, gooey lumps which continued along the entire length of the monster's curling and twisting snake-like top before it came to a sharp, glistening point at its end. It was at that time that I ran and got my shotgun, but when I got back outside, I found that I was extremely outnumbered. The monster had multiplied tenfold, and there were even more of them spilling out of the forest's shadows. They gathered strength as they moved, each of them drastically different from the last, but all of them like unstable, misshapen animals with snake-like tentacly appendages that stuck out unnaturally from various parts of their bodies. The things began to move toward my chicken coop, and as their slimy red tentacles slopped onto the wire fencing around the henhouse, it began to slowly corrode away the metal, oxidizing it and turning it to rust before ripping it away to allow access to the birds inside. I took a few shots at them, but it did little to no good. I could blow pieces of them away, but they paid no mind like it wasn't even happening. A few of them lost entire chunks of their bodies, but they just kept on coming. I helplessly watched as one of my hens was consumed by one of the creatures in much the same fashion as the fence that preceded it. But before I was forced to run back inside my home, I had little choice. I was cut off from the world by a good 8 or 9 mile stretch of woods in just about every direction. All I could do was sit and wait for my inevitable, slow and painful death as those things melted away my flesh to bone. I waited inside for quite a long time for my agonizing demise, but it didn't come. Then I waited even longer, trying to gather the courage to look out the window, and when I finally did, my heart began to race once again. There they were, still wandering aimlessly about my yard, while others stood eerily still, facing my house, completely motionless, waiting for their next meal. But none of them would approach my house. Why? Were they like vampires? Did I have to invite them in or something? If so, that kind of defeated the purpose of their corrosive super slime. So, why weren't they coming in to eat me? Then I realized that each one of them were standing just outside the reach of my deck light. Not a single one of them would set hand or foot, nor creepy foot-hand thing, inside the light. They had only come out after the sun had set. Maybe they were a bit like vampires after all. For hours, they crept just outside the light, lurking in the darkness. Then, just as they had come, they all fumbled back into the forest once again, just an hour or so before dawn. It was the same thing, at random, every week. Every week these things visited me. I thought about bringing someone here to witness it too, but I didn't have much in the way of friends or even people skills for that matter. And to be honest, at the time I kinda had a bit of a drinking problem, and no one would believe the town drunk about crazy little creatures appearing out of the darkness and melting everything in their path. So I didn't tell anybody. I figured as long as I took a few extra precautions, installed some floodlights, invest in flashlights and light bulbs, and order a generator from the hardware store in town, I'd be all right. I should have picked up and left after the first night. I didn't know where else to go. I didn't have the money to leave, and I didn't really want to leave. My grandfather built this house, and I didn't want to give it up. I didn't want to leave it for those things to devour. I stocked up on everything I could to keep myself safe, and it worked for a long time. But as I said, the power went out last night, and now I have to rely entirely on my gas generator. A generator that I had to keep a good ways away from my house, because I wasn't messing around. I got the biggest and most powerful generator I could find, but it was fairly old, and that thing had the sound of a jet engine. Not to mention, it put out more smoke than a fire in a smoke bomb section of a firework factory. If I had that thing any closer to my house, I would die from the fumes before those little monsters could even set foot or tentacle out of the forest. I waited for the horrors to return, And once again, I watched the familiar, random flopping of the shambling beasts as they irrationally moved out of the shadows before shifting to an upright position when their prey came into view. The things lurked ever forward, and I prepared all the lights I had obtained and prayed to God that the generator would hold out. I had no other options. I had grown to not be as fearful of the things as I once was. I mean, they still terrified me, but it was more like a concerned and horrifying fascination with these tentacled beasts. I sat on my deck, instead of hiding away inside my home, and watched them surround the house. One in particular appeared to have a kind of personality to it. I named it Tippy, because it was never quite accustomed to its upright position and would occasionally tip over and fall to the ground, where its serpentine head, covered in bulbous, slimy growths, would flail about as if it was confused at what the rest of its body had just done. The rest of the time, however, it would either walk, hunched over on all fours, with its back legs bent backwards, similar to that of a dog's hind legs, or upright, with its legs in much the same fashion. The thing's long, spindly fingers and toes would curl into the dirt, and it appeared as though it wanted to charge through the light. But it never did. It never moved even within 10 inches of the outer rim of the light's radiance. It was about midnight when I heard my generator begin to putter and spit out, bellowing clouds of black smoke, causing the lights to flicker a bit in the process. This is what scared the crap out of me. I quickly ran to the generator toward the back of my house in an attempt to keep it running, but the lights flickered once more and then cut out as the generator let out a loud boom before falling quickly silent. I turned in fear and watched as the writhing beasts began to coil and flop around themselves before walking forward, advancing quickly in my direction. I fumbled, desperately trying to start the generator up again, but it was no use. The power was dead, and if I didn't get out of there quickly, I would be too. I was cut off from the road, cut off from my truck, and my only escape. I watched as a couple of the writhing things attached themselves to the corner of the structure of my house before they devoured it, melting through it and absorbing the matter of the wooden post into their unnatural, misshapen bodies. I turned and ran into the woods, somewhat in the direction of where the beasts had come. I had no other means of escape and no other direction to go. The beasts had cut me off from any way out, and I knew that I wouldn't be safe this way either, because I was heading right toward wherever these things called home, and I didn't know what awaited me in the forest ahead. The only defense I had now was a flashlight with a clip on the end of it, fastened to my belt. But I didn't have much time to even think about it. I had to run. I had to run right then and there. The things advanced toward my heels as I ran through the woods, branches from trees clawing at my cheeks as I passed by them. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop. All the things pursued me. It appeared as though they were not affected in any way by the draining of stamina, because they did not stop. They did not tire. They showed no signs of exhaustion. They just kept coming. The sounds of twigs snapping beneath my feet as I ran and the crickets chirping in the night was soon broken by the sound of screaming. It was like the sound of a screaming child calling out in pain, cries of agony and fear wailing through the night. As I got closer to the sound, it sounded a bit less like a screaming child and more like the terrified sounds of a trapped animal, screaming somewhere, as if it were the next meal of these flailing beasts that chased me, screaming in pain as they devoured it alive. But I quickly discovered that this wasn't the case at all. Not by a long shot, when I suddenly dropped through a large opening in the ground. I fell a few yards and landed hard on a pile of rocks at the bed of the cave opening that I had fallen through. I had not caused the land to give way. I simply found the opening entirely by accident and dropped down into it. Luckily for me, I only had a few scrapes and bruises, but was able to climb to my feet before the beasts behind me poured through into the cave's opening. The things did not follow, though. Instead, they waited up in the open night, not knowing where their prey had gone, or waiting for me to poke my head out so they could melt through my skull. I didn't know which, and I wasn't going to find out. I was trapped down here, and I didn't have any choice but to go deeper into the cave. The wailing screams echoed through the tunnels I now walked in, and they grew ever louder. I was stuck between a metaphorical rock and a hard place. I had monsters waiting to devour me alive at the cave's mouth on one side, and blood-curdling screams of unknown origin from the other. I was terrified, but I had to press forward toward the fear I didn't know, over the sickening knowledge of the fear that I did. The somewhat tight quarters of the cave's walls gave way to a wide-open chamber with another hole that opened up to the night air. A single ray of moonlight shining through the cave's opening to dimly light the source of the screaming beneath. There, just out of reach of the light from the sky that shone through, was a hulking figure of some kind of animal. At first, I thought it was another one of those things, only much, much larger. A tentacled beast the size of a buffalo. But as my eyes further adjusted into the darkness, I found that it was not one of those things at all. It appeared to have the curved horns of a ram that curled down to a goat-like head, with eyes that appeared to glow with a light, lime green color. The giant, haunched-over body seemed to be covered in various layers of shades of a green-colored fur. But it wasn't fur. It was more like some kind of moss and foliage that sprouted from the creature's skin. An array of plant life sprouted from the beast's back. The beast's underbelly was exposed to show a light-colored, flesh-toned skin, where several rows of hair-covered breasts hung swollen beneath it. The creature's hooved feet appeared to be bound by some kind of viscous reddish substance. So dark, it appeared almost black, like a pool of blackened, coagulated blood held tightly onto the beast and held it there in place, like dozens of little crimson-hued tentacles clinging to its legs and forcing it to remain there. The thing screamed in fear, its eyes looking at me pleadingly as if to ask for help. My own eyes went from looking into those of the being to following the red substance to its source. A large, metal container lay in pretty rough condition near to the bottom of the cave's opening. It was dented and cracked open, allowing for the crimson slime to leak its way through the fissure in the metal crate. As I inspected the container, I heard the sound of beeping off in the distance, and what to me sounded like the engine of a large truck, causing me to look up toward the opening of the cave. The recently formed new cave mouth opened up to the base of a hill that led up to a nearby highway. A truck had probably lost its cargo, which resulted in what I now laid my eyes upon. It was only then that I remembered that I still had a flashlight. In all the chaos and fear of being consumed alive, I forgot that I still had some kind of means of defense against the monsters. The flashlight allowed for a better look at the crate, which now leaked the sanguine-colored goo onto this large and pained animal. The metal box was pretty beat up, and I was unable to tell exactly where it came from or who to call to dispose of it. But I was able to read some initials as I cleaned off the dirt covering the box. I see a Icarus? Maybe they flew too close to the sun and their knowledge is killing the wildlife. I shone my flashlight from the crate down onto the substance that leaked from it, and as the light hit it, it began to smoke and sizzle, reacting to the light. The viscous liquid that appeared to cling to itself, forming a slime that then changed its nature to be more like water, liquefying and pooling down onto the cave's floor. I followed the trail of slime with my flashlight to where it hung onto the great beast, and I watched as the slime turned to a liquid and dropped away from the giant green goat. I once again found myself praying that this thing would be grateful for its release and not charge at me, because I knew that if this thing decided to take that course of action, that my bones would easily be crushed beneath its massive horns. The great beast lifted its hooves from the mess beneath it and began to move slowly toward me. I froze. I didn't know what to do. I had no chance of escaping something so large. It could surely outrun me with ease. So I just froze. It was then that the curled horns of the beast unwound and straightened. The horns' tips split into 5 and formed into fingers on a hand at the end of 2 large arms that shifted down beneath the face of the beast. A face that then shifted itself, cracking inward, changing from the shape of a goat's head to that of a strikingly beautiful woman. Her skin fair and smooth, with a pale green tint to the flesh tone, and her soft, glistening hair rolling backward into the foliage down her back. My fear and panic was soon washed away by calm when the woman's lips curled upwards at the edges, giving me a warm smile, making me feel as though the sun was radiating warm against my skin. This was followed by one of the softest hands that had sprouted forth from what was once horns, falling softly upon my bearded cheek, caressing me gently like the feeling of millions of tiny little silk-covered blades of grass in her skin. Then the woman's arms withdrew and curled slowly back into the horns of the ram before her face stretched back outward into the shape of a goat. Then she turned and jumped up onto the rocks and out of the mouth of the cave. I was no longer afraid. I was no longer filled with fear of the beasts that wanted to consume me. Not that I needed to be fearful anyway, because they were all gone. There were no more tentacled monsters, no more slimy, consuming beasts. Only the beautiful wildlife of nature. Only the peacefulness of the forest. I was at peace, but my mind was still filled with several unanswered questions. What were those things? What was that goat woman? Did she make those things? And if so, who started all of this? What is Icarus?
Well, that was unbelievably unexpected. Who'd have thought the best place to find a date would be 6 feet under, necrophiliacs excluded. But don't go too far to dig up more fear. Just make sure to come back here again next weekend. And as always, like, share, subscribe, and set notifications so I can catch you all next Saturday.